I'm XCG and welcome to Pernicious Chattel. Just finished editing my first video and I have to say, I'm not stellar in front of the camera. I'm hoping that if those of you who do end up following me, the few masochists among you who want to follow me, I hope that I get better. So here we go with episode number 2, titled, Are Companies Really Good for You? After spending decades of my life trying and failing to find satisfaction through work, I'm now considering that perhaps that failure wasn't 100% my own. We hear many criticisms about companies: influence peddling, environmental degradation, abusive business practices. It is hardly controversial to say that corporations are not always a positive force in the world. Yet, having a senior position in one of these companies is generally regarded as the mark of personal success, if not a significant amount of good fortune. In fact, most parents would be perfectly happy if one of their children were to take up such a position. But once viewed with brutal honesty, can we truly be so unconcerned about the experience of employees embedded in a faceless leviathan? I believe that modern companies are far from beneficial, and working for one can be dehumanizing, if even twisting an otherwise healthy personality. Now, before I go any further, I need to offer up a disclaimer. I'm not criticizing the company I used to work for specifically. Obviously, I am drawing on my own personal experience to guide what I have to say, but I don't believe that my company was especially guilty of bad behavior. Quite to the contrary, the company that I work for did make a concerted effort to be a good place to work and to treat their employees with respect. But their initiatives were relatively good versus other companies. It is only versus a more objective metric can we truly answer the question of whether companies are good or bad. I praise my former employer for trying in good faith consistently. But unfortunately, intending something is not the same as delivering on something. So back to the question, is a career in a large organization enriching? Does it benefit the human being? Does it leave you better off or worse? If you live in a Western country, it is generally believed that private companies, especially large and successful ones, offer the greatest benefits and opportunities in terms of remuneration, pay and benefits. This seems to be true. Maybe not for frontline workers, especially those without specific skills or extensive education. But it is true, at least, for those who are able to find more senior, skilled positions. Pay and benefits are extremely important. Obviously, you're grateful for anything that allows you to escape poverty. It has been established and known for a long time, especially from researchers such as Maslow, that meeting these base needs are critical to achieving any other of the human aspirations. Having physical needs met and some modicum of security is critical before any other human aspiration can be pursued. Economists also might argue that the utility of money is incredibly important. Money allows us both to satisfy physical and psychological needs because it allows us a type of social power, an ability to purchase from others those things that we want. And money provides a measuring stick by which we can compare our success to others, theoretically supporting growth of self-esteem. But the research is also quite clear that once we reach a certain threshold of money, money becomes less and less potent as a motivator. Economists would describe this as diminishing returns, and my own experience certainly bears this out. At the beginning of my career, I was extremely impressed and motivated by my salary. But as time went on, I became less motivated, aside from fear that if I didn't work hard enough, I would lose that salary. Certainly, bonuses and raises did provide an additional motivation, but unfortunately only for a very short term. I took some pride in how much I did make, but ultimately that pride was a brittle and shallow thing. After all, I couldn't go around bragging about how much I made without seeming like a complete knob. Besides, I earned a pittance versus other elite earners in the world. In fact, what really motivated me in my job was promotions and recognition. I wanted the respect of the people that I worked with, and I wanted to be identified and treated like a competent professional. I wanted promotions for the respect that the title could give me. And I wanted promotions because I wanted to be in a position where I had more power to act independently. I was motivated by a desire to make the business more successful, and I believed that senior positions afforded me greater power to make that happen. My motivations are common and discussed in available theory. Again, Maslow points out that once we satisfy our base needs, survival and safety, then we quite immediately start looking for other needs to be met. We want to belong, we want to achieve esteem, and we want to grow in self-actualization. It is in these needs where modern business culture is so deadly to the human spirit. Our society does allow for professional friendships. Unfortunately, a professional friendship is a fairly narrow type of relationship where everyone understands that standards of behavior, effort, and ultimately your contribution are far more important, take precedence over the relationship itself. So no matter how liked we are, we understand explicitly that we can be thrown out, fired, the second that we don't appear to contribute or behave in a way that the company demands. As a result, these are relatively poor sources of love and belonging. And most would advise that we are far better off to get those needs met somewhere else other than work. As they say, he who microwaves fish today will not be employed here tomorrow. The need of esteem is even harder to come by. Although training materials advised against it, many managers believe that their role is purely supervisory. That is, doing their job well means constantly evaluating and criticizing the work of underlings. They might call this fine-tuning or stress testing or being challenging. But ultimately it comes down to a pure criticism of the ideas, plans, and results of an employee. A manager will pick apart the work and ideas of a worker and examine it for any potential flaws. As a receiver of this criticism, it appears to you like you don't have the trust of your supervisors, like they aren't impressed with your performance or appreciative of your ideas. It appears as if you are unreliable in their eyes. On occasion, of course, a talented leader might both question an idea and also praise it, all the while offering suggestions to strengthen the idea without undermining it. But more often it is simple, not good enough. Go back and work on a plan that I like better. This damages self-esteem by making an employee frustrated and feel disrespected. Well, I believe it is unconscious on the most part. There is a clear lack of trust being demonstrated by holding employees up to exceptionally high standards. Then there is the even more pernicious and painful boss who fears making decisions at all, or who wants to be perceived as being particularly intelligent. So this boss will push back irrationally against even the greatest of ideas. These tendencies to push all idea generation down onto lower level employees cause employees to fail at generating successful ideas repeatedly and keeps the onus on the employees to do the hard work, while also sending a message that your ideas are crap and you're in this on your own. Some management theories, like Agile Project Management, include components to improve the situation. For instance, changing a manager's role from traditionally supervisory to one that's much more focused on facilitation, thereby empowering workers to have much more autonomy and flexibility in their approach. Agile management has become all the rage in business circles, but at least in my experience, I've yet to see it implemented effectively. Companies will either try to wall off agile teams while leaving the overall hierarchy of the company in place, or they try to use agile teams structure as an excuse to get more out of fewer employees while not implementing the policy or management culture changes necessary to support it. They also quite often fail to retrain or replace managers and expect these old dogs to learn new tricks. What happens is teams are reorganized, but managers still have the last say, don't believe that they are responsible for helping a team to be successful, and continue to act as gatekeepers, believing it is the best way to keep from making mistakes. And at the end of implementing of this purportedly transformative approach, all that you've got is a less well-defined workplace with more confusion and overwork, but without the empowerment that helps to motivate or show trust to the workers. In the end, all you end up with is management spouting a new and ultimately meaningless buzzword. So let's move on to the last of Maslow's human needs, self-actualization. There are a number of components to this need, such as authenticity, honesty, acceptance, truth, and a creative spirit. It is in this human need where we see workplaces failing so dramatically. Most workplaces are extremely antithetical to these values. Workplaces, by and large, seek conformity in a very militant, if subtle way. As Eve Schulp points out, workers who do not conform are deemed to be too negative and critical, or not efficient, and most certainly not willing to do the job. An article in the California Law Review points out the business literature suggests a number of ways in which firms can change and strengthen their corporate culture, from the structuring of formal policies to the creation of rituals and ceremonies. But most frequently espoused means of cultural influence is selection and reward for cultural fit. Managers are urged, in other words, to screen employees according to how well their values and behavior fit in. One author describing the hiring process at a company with a strong corporate culture as one in which every new member must be interviewed by at least 5 and 10 people, and only if that individual is acceptable to all is he or she offered the job. When interviewers at this company were asked what they looked for in a candidate, they responded, "We want someone who'll fit in." The article goes on to point out that this conformity can go to the extremes where some offices are dominated by a boys' club, and those who aren't part of the in-group are not given equal opportunities to achieve recognition or promotion. They caution that this tendency to conform intentionally and unintentionally enforces a workplace culture that leads to the worst forms of discrimination based on gender, race, religion, culture, sex preference, and so on. And the message is simply fit in or fuck off. My own experience bears this out. At one point in my career, I was the vice president reporting to a regional president. Once a year, I would meet with my boss and have our annual review. In one instance, he indicated that I was doing a good job, but I really needed to work on my professional image. For instance, I shouldn't carry a rucksack. Now, he was referring to a $750 To-Me professional backpack, but he said it didn't appear to be professional. On another occasion, he indicated that I would need to stay working in less attractive emerging markets because I wasn't polished enough. For instance, I wore shirts that were just too colorful. Now, he was referring to a Brooks Brothers button-down dress shirt, which was the height of conservatism, however, did have a check pattern that was covered in, oh my God, red. He was actually correct in his prediction. In the 8 years since those conversations took place, I did not progress beyond managing emerging markets. While I know that my image wasn't the only factor, it was undoubtedly important. What was shocking about this feedback was that I intentionally hid many of the aspects of my personality that make me particularly unique. But even showing the relatively minor indications of uniqueness were already too wild and quote-unquote unprofessional. Another disturbing example of conformity that I witnessed was the incredibly slow implementation of diversity initiatives. The company I worked for was wholly owned by an Asian company. Yet within my company, there was relatively few Asians in senior roles. Diversity was an identified objective for the company. I did see a number of high potential Asians pass by for development opportunities because For instance, their English wasn't good enough. They weren't smooth enough in their presentation skills. Or because they were hesitant to speak up forcefully. Of course, collectivist Asian culture stresses respect for authority. So being modest in their contributions was natural and to be expected. While the Western dominant culture of the company emphasized confidence and assertiveness. In other words, Asian culture clashed with the dominant culture, and as a result, Asians were at a disadvantage. It was similar for women. The problem of gender disparities was very clearly identified and discussed at length. A firm and formal statement was published about correcting the situation. Yet, almost the same time, the company was launching new policies on work relocation, making relocation less optional and including no accommodation for family needs or other pressures that a working mother might experience. In other words, women could succeed at the company as long as they deprioritized family and were pure mercenaries like the men were expected to be. In other words, my company's heart may have been in the right place, but only so long as everyone worked in the same way, dressed in the same way, thought in the same way, and spoke in the same way. Senior management seemed to be blissfully unaware that the diversity they were talking about was simply about numbers, rather than any kind of real tangible diversity. As Professor Kenneth Minogue writes, "It is a corrupt sense of community where fitting in to a single pattern of life is required. Enforced conformity is an attack on our humanity. It keeps us from behaving authentically, and it keeps us from being honest or truly accepting differences. It keeps us in a prison of silence where our full humanity is left unexplored, ignored, or suppressed. Moreover, enforced conformity is bad for our mental health. We know, for instance, that LGBTQ+ people who don't come out are subject to much higher rates of suicide and depression. And while LGBTQ rights were officially protected under my company's policy, and many, other forms of personality oppression, forced behavior suppression, similarly likely to cause mental harm to those who are thereby victimized. The experience is somewhat like being a spy or an undercover agent, but you don't ever get to go home, nor do you have some large, strong, supportive secret organization that is behind you and supports your authentic self. I have no doubt that some would argue that, of course, teamwork is essential for business, and conformity is necessary for teamwork. Therefore, conformity is unavoidable, even if it's actually bad. But let me point out that this is far from a proven fact. For instance, conformity is antithetical to innovation, and it probably makes businesses far less flexible and less effective, even if more efficient in routine tasks. Conformity and maintenance of personal fictions also requires accessing internal resources and energy, leaving less available to be put towards productive work. Moreover, forced conformity creates undue caution in the worker, and in some cases outright fear. Thereby, conformity can damage trust, and trust is as essential as conformity to teamwork. Frankly, too much conformity makes you bland and stupid and rigid and prone to unthinking group decision-making. Whereas real diversity requires courage and conviction, and it pays back in creativity and in flexibility, and most likely in much more resiliency. So to recap my argument, there is a dehumanizing character to corporate culture. Your entire value to the workplace, to your community and your workplace friends is driven by your usefulness. Failing to remain useful is reasonable grounds to erase you from that community. There is no need for your superiors to show any specific gratitude for your contributions aside from the pay that has been promised to you, and they may unintentionally or intentionally act critically in ways that undermine any satisfaction that you may gain from a job well done. Finally, it is dehumanizing because it denies you the right of self-expression, honesty, authenticity, and true creativity. I can hear the critics now. If you don't like the culture of any company, then you're free to leave and go to another. In fact, you're free to become an entrepreneur, create a company of your own, and turn it into whatever you want. But let's be realistic here. That is far easier to say, and it's extremely difficult to do. The issue here is one of a power imbalance. When you're without money and find an organization that pays you, it becomes suddenly quite easy to toss aside your individuality in favor of reliable paycheck. On top of that, we are indoctrinated from childhood to believe that work should be unpleasant and that work in and of itself is some kind of transcendent moral good. So in our Western culture, certainly there is not a lot of support for any individual who feels somehow oppressed or abused by the work environment. You can hear the right-wing critic yelling right now, the workplace is not supposed to be good for your humanity. That is why you have a life outside. That is why we all need to stand up for family values. To this, I say, if you are spending between 40 and 60 hours a week working, then you are spending anywhere between 35% and 65% of your waking hours doing something actively dehumanizing. And that is simply too much of your total time to ignore the costs. Total hours of exposure aside, the modern workplace may keep you isolated in other ways. Mobile working, for instance, requires that you have to be on call in all hours due to the demands of your mobile device. Being a commuting worker requires that you lose hours of your life sitting in traffic. Being an employee who is expected to travel on evenings and weekends, or who is being moved to a distant city, thereby losing regular contact with family and friends. In other words, the modern workplace often acts well beyond what we think of as a standard 40-hour work week in ways that may extend into all areas of your life. And as a result, having that workplace be unhealthy and inhuman is particularly concerning when the alternatives for your humanity and for your individual expression become so constrained. We can't be blind to the fact that modern work has acted like a corrosive acid on a lot of authentic human connection aside from the professional environment. And it is becoming increasingly all-encompassing. Even if the trend to greater sacrifices demanded by a modern career is irreversible, and I certainly hope that it isn't, we need to begin to identify where our work is damaging our humanity. After all, if work doesn't enhance our life in tangible ways, then we have to admit that perhaps our loyalties are dangerously misplaced. So, rant over, and I for one feel better. I hope you were likewise entertained and possibly maybe willing to look just a bit more critically at your job. This is XCG signing off. Please consider a quick poke at that subscription button. It would be much appreciated. And I'm wishing you Godspeed on your journey to freedom.